Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision, right?
Oh, for sure. It's treated a lot like engineering.
Yeah, exactly. Like you fall off a ladder, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line through the bone, and the doctor just points to the film and says, there it is, there's the problem.
Right. It's comforting because the pathology is visible, the disruption in the system is totally localized.
And the solution is mechanical.
Exactly. I mean, we are deeply conditioned to prefer things that can be categorized, isolated, and fixed with like a splint or a pill.
But then you step into the world of neurodevelopment, trauma, and, well, psychological architecture, and suddenly that x-ray machine is entirely useless.
Yeah, completely obsolete.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky, where the lines between the biological and the symbolic don't just blur, they, completely overwrite one another.
Which is pretty much the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. When the injury isn't to the bone, but to the meaning-making apparatus of the mind itself, standard clinical metrics often just fail to capture the reality of the lived experience.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today you and I are diving into a deeply personal, fiercely philosophical manuscript. It's titled, When Consumption Becomes Contamination.
It is an intense read.
Very intense. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore an unexpected, really profound journey. We're going to look at how exposure to extreme internet pornography fundamentally altered one person's relationship with the most basic, inescapable biological act we have.
Eating.
Yes, eating. This exposure led to a unique and severe eating disorder that was rooted entirely in symbolic meaning rather than, body image, caloric restriction, or physical aesthetics.
What's fascinating here is that the manuscript is a remarkable text because it operates as a phenomenology.
Right. And for those of us who aren't academics, what does that actually mean in this context?
Well, by that I mean it isn't a statistical analysis or a broad sociological study. It is a meticulous internal description of what an experience felt like from the inside looking out.
So it's heavily subjective.
Exactly. It's an exploration of the subjective reality that emerges when the symbolic boundaries in our brain, specifically the boundaries delineating sexuality, violence, nourishment, just collapse under the weight of specific digital stimuli.
And because this text wades into such culturally charged waters, we are talking about extreme pornography, heavy critiques of hyperconsumerism, and severe mental health struggles, we are approaching this purely as explorers of a single human psychology.
That's right.
We aren't here to take sides, litigate the morality of the adult entertainment industry, validate a specific political critique of capitalism, or claim this is some universal reaction. We are looking at the architecture of this specific mind and how it constructed its reality. We're just impartially tracing the invisible lines from the screen to the nervous system.
That framing is vital, really. The author themselves notes that human psychology is way too varied to claim a one-to-one causal link for every individual who encounters this material.
Right, so our role is purely analytical.
Exactly. We're looking at the mechanics of a specific psychological collapse, examining the underlying cognitive and emotional gears that ground the author's philosophical arguments.
And if you were listening right now and thinking, I don't have an eating disorder, I don't relate to this specific struggle, why should I spend my time on this?
It's a fair question.
It is. But you should care, because this deep dive reveals the underlying vulnerability of the human brain to the media we consume every single day. This is a story about how meaning gets made, how it gets corrupted, and how the invisible symbols we take in quietly rewire our biological instincts.
Which is a phenomenon that impacts every single one of us, whether we realize it or not.
Oh, absolutely. So to understand how that rewiring happens, we have to look at how the mind organizes information in the first place. The text argues, quite compellingly, that the mind isn't a filing cabinet of isolated facts. It's this incredibly sensitive web of associations.
Yeah, associative learning is basically the bedrock of human cognition.
Like how things connect.
Right. The brain is, at its core, a relentless prediction engine. It is constantly scanning the environment and asking one question: what predicts what?
So it's always trying to stay one step ahead.
Exactly. When you experience a stimulus, your brain doesn't just record the event in a vacuum. It records the context, the ambient temperature, the emotional state you were in, the sensory inputs, and it wires them all together.
Oh, wow.
In neuroscience, this is often summarized by Hebbian theory.
Which is
Neurons that fire together, wire together.
neurons that fire together, wire together. I like that. So the manuscript explores how this associative learning mechanism collided with the author's early, unfettered internet access. Like a lot of people who grew up as digital natives, initial exposure was just driven by mundane curiosity. But the author maps out a distinct, insidious transition here.
The consumption moved from curiosity to familiarity, and eventually into a state of total normalization.
Right. And specifically, they found themselves drawn into and desensitized by imagery centered around intense domination, gagging, and forced oral penetration.
And to understand why that specific imagery caused such a profound psychological rupture, we really have to talk about the biology of disgust.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
It is. From an evolutionary standpoint, disgust is a masterpiece of survival engineering. It is a biological imperative. It's a core component of what scientists call the behavioral immune system.
So it's like a defense mechanism.
Exactly. It evolved to protect us from pathogens, spoiled meat, and infectious diseases. If you encounter the smell of rotting food, your prefrontal cortex doesn't need to logically deduce that the food contains harmful bacteria.
Right, you just gag.
Your body bypasses logic entirely and physically recoils. It is a hardwired, instinctive withdrawal meant to prevent contamination.
But disgust is incredibly greedy, isn't it? Like, it doesn't stay neatly confined to the biological realm of rotting meat or murky water.
Not at all.
It's highly contagious, and it eagerly attaches itself to the conceptual realm.
Disgust is arguably the most malleable of our primal emotions. It easily migrates from biological threats to psychological, moral, or symbolic threats.
Meaning, we can be disgusted by an idea just as much as a bad piece of fish.
Yes, we learn to attach the exact same visceral revulsion to ideas, to social behaviors, to moral transgressions. What began millions of years ago as a mechanism to protect the physical body from biological infection is basically repurposed by the modern brain to protect the psyche from conceptual infection.
And in this text, the author describes how the overwhelming emotional response of disgust, which was initially triggered by the sheer aggression and humiliation of the pornography they were normalizing, began to bleed out of the digital environment.
It generalized.
It generalized.
Right.
I was trying to visualize the mechanics of how an emotion leaps from a digital video to a physical object, and it made me think of a massively complex soundboard at a live concert.
Okay, I can picture that.
You have all these different inputs and outputs, thousands of wires carrying different signals. Imagine you have a microphone labeled intimacy or vulnerability.
Right.
But somehow, deep in the dark tangle of the system, the wire gets crossed and plugged into the massive stadium speaker labeled disgust and mortal danger.
Oh, wow. Yes.
At first, maybe it's just a little static when you use the mic, but associative learning reinforces that pathway. The connection gets so thoroughly soldered together that eventually, every single time someone speaks into the intimacy microphone, all you get is an agonizing, deafening feedback loop of danger.
That is a brilliant way to look at it. The physical equipment of the brain is functioning perfectly.
Hmm.
It is doing exactly what it's wired to do. But the wiring itself has become fundamentally crossed.
Exactly.
To build on your soundboard analogy, the brain's priority isn't objective accuracy. Its priority is survival.
So it doesn't care if the threat is real, just that it might be.
Right. The amygdala and the insular cortex, which are the regions heavily involved in processing threat and disgust, they learn the association between the imagery of domination and the physical organ involved, the mouth.
Okay.
The brain takes the feelings of humiliation and degradation embedded in those sexual images, and it solders them to the biological act of oral reception.
And then it just spreads.
Yes. From there, the nervous system begins treating a completely harmless, necessary object, like a simple plate of food, with the exact same emotional alarm bells as a psychological threat.
So the dividing line between biological danger and symbolic danger just ceases to exist.
It completely vanishes.
But this is where I find myself deeply frustrated on behalf of the author, and I think anyone listening would push back here too. Where is reason in all of this?
That's the logical question.
Right. If I am sitting at a kitchen table and I have a glass of tap water in front of me, my rational adult brain knows with absolute certainty that it is just a glass of water. It's safe, it's necessary, it's neutral. Why does the emotional associative brain win a fight against undeniable physical reality?
Because in the hierarchy of the nervous system, survival always outranks logic.
Always.
Always. It's the constant tension between the prefrontal cortex, the slow, energy-heavy, logical reasoning center, and the limbic system, which governs rapid survival instincts.
Okay, so the limbic system is faster.
Much faster. In the calculus of evolution, a false negative, meaning you fail to be disgusted by a poisonous berry, eat it and die, is a catastrophic evolutionary failure.
Right, game over.
Exactly. But a false positive, meaning you feel disgust toward a safe berry and spit it out, just costs you a few calories.
Better tough than sorry.
Right. Therefore, the brain is heavily biased toward false positives. When the limbic system flags an association as a threat, it floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol.
So you're in full fight or flight before you even think about it.
Yes. By the time the prefrontal cortex comes online to say, hey, this is just a glass of water, the physical sensation of dread has already hijacked the body. Reason arrives too late to dismantle the association.
There is a line in the manuscript that perfectly crystallizes that exact defeat of reason. The author writes, "The imagination digests symbols just as relentlessly as the stomach digests food."
It's a haunting realization. The emotional contagion attached itself to the physical mechanics of swallowing long before the author consciously understood the depth of the conditioning.
We aren't talking about being triggered by similar imagery, right?
No, we're talking about the corruption of mundane daily maintenance. Brushing teeth, swallowing a daily vitamin, feeling the texture of saliva.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Suddenly, these profoundly ordinary actions triggered unwanted intrusive echoes of the dominance and degradation they had consumed online.
It turns the body into a haunted house. The mouth is just trying to do its biological job, but the meaning of that job has been utterly hijacked. Which brings us to the actual physical battleground where all of this played out. Because the mouth isn't just a utilitarian organ, is it?
Not at all.
It is perhaps the most overloaded, complex symbol in human experience.
If you look at it developmentally, the mouth is our literal gateway to the world. Before a newborn can focus its eyes or grasp with its hands, it explores its environment through the mouth.
Oh, right. Babies put everything in their mouths.
Exactly. It is the primary interface between the internal self and the external universe. We use it to kiss, to speak, to draw breath, to sing, to receive nourishment, to express our deepest affections. It is the universal symbol of life, reception, and connection.
But the author outlines how the specific aesthetic of the media they consumed violently inverted that symbol. Through the lens of extreme pornography, the mouth was transformed from a symbol of life and connection into a tool for degradation, a site of forced submission, and an instrument of mere consumption.
And to understand how this happened, we really have to look at the gonzo aesthetic that dominates this corner of the internet.
Yeah, let's talk about that because that's crucial.
We're talking about a style of media where the camera itself acts as an aggressive participant. Intimacy isn't just absent, it is deliberately, systematically erased.
It's replaced by spectacle.
Spectacle, endurance, and power dynamics that reduce the human body to a vessel. What's fascinating here is how the text analyzes the language and visual framing of that aesthetic.
How so?
The individuals on screen are stripped of their subjectivity. They aren't partners. They are objects to be used, taken, or destroyed. And in that specific visual language, the act of gagging or choking is frequently highlighted as a marker of the scene's intensity.
Now bring that back to our discussion on the biology of disgust. Biologically, the gag reflex is the expulsion of poison.
Right.
It is the body frantically declaring, "Get this out of me to save my life."
But symbolically, within the context of that media, the reflex takes on a vastly different, almost moral dimension.
Precisely. Symbolically, the reflex of gagging became a manifestation of the thought, "This does not belong inside me." It was the body physically revolting against the psychological degradation.
But because the author was repeatedly watching these acts in a context of sexual arousal and entertainment, the biological reflex of the throat, the emotional feeling of moral disgust, and the visual imagery of dominance became hopelessly entangled.
So the meaning got completely flipped.
Yes. The mouth was no longer an organ of safe, willing reception. It had been fundamentally recoded as an organ of forced submission.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The author pushes us to recognize that this heavy symbolic weighting of the mouth isn't just a byproduct of niche internet subcultures. It is baked into the very foundation of how we conceptualize the world.
It is everywhere.
Think about our everyday language, the metaphors we use without even noticing them. If you're listening, think about it. We say we have to swallow our pride or swallow a lie. We tell people to digest that information. We devour books. If someone does something terrible, we say we can't stomach it. Our cognitive language relies entirely on the digestive tract to represent how we take on the psychological and intellectual weight of the world.
That is the essence of embodied cognition. We don't understand abstract concepts purely through logic. We understand them through the physical experiences of our bodies.
Taking an idea into your mind is neurologically mapped onto the act of taking food into your mouth.
Exactly. So, when the author's symbolic understanding of their own mouth was compromised, when the act of reception became inextricably linked with trauma and degradation, it didn't just mean they couldn't watch that specific genre of video anymore.
It was much bigger than that.
It meant the foundational metaphor they used to interact with reality had collapsed.
Yeah.
It ruined their ability to exist comfortably inside their own physical form.
Because you can't just opt out of having a mouth. You can't unplug it or leave it in another room while you recalibrate.
That is the crux of the crisis. When a symbol as vital as the mouth is psychologically contaminated, the biological imperative to use it, the sheer, unavoidable necessity of eating to stay alive, forces a daily, hourly confrontation with that trauma.
You can't escape it.
You are required to interact with a deeply contaminated symbol multiple times a day just to survive. The necessity of eating becomes the mechanism of psychological torture.
Which leads us directly into the manifestation of the disorder itself. Because the author did eventually stop eating, or at least eating became a nearly impossible task.
Yes.
And I want to be very careful to emphasize the mechanics of this, because when we hear the phrase eating disorder, society has conditioned us to immediately picture a very specific narrative, right?
Absolutely.
Societal beauty standards, diet culture, calorie counting, body dysmorphia, weight loss. But the author is adamant in separating their experience from that narrative. This had zero to do with calories, fitness, or a desire to be thin.
It was a disorder built entirely on meaning. The pathology was rooted in the symbolic weight that the physical act of eating had acquired.
So it wasn't about the food itself.
No, the innocence of swallowing was gone. To ingest anything, even a piece of plain bread, felt like an act of surrender, an acceptance of vulnerability, and a total loss of agency.
The text describes this period as a civil war. And I honestly can't think of a better phrase to capture the tragedy of it. It was a civil war between the physical body, which is just blindly biologically trying to preserve life, and the mind, which is frantically trying to preserve the person's psychological integrity by rejecting a contaminated symbol.
This raises an important question about the nature of contamination itself. In clinical psychology, we frequently encounter contamination obsessions, most commonly associated with obsessive-compulsive disorder.
But the popular understanding of that is usually a fear of physical pathogens like germs, dirt, bodily fluids.
Right. What the manuscript describes, though, is a profound, debilitating fear of psychological impurity. It wasn't a fear of physical bacteria on the food. It was an existential terror of what the food and the act of receiving it symbolized.
And as the author poignantly notes, you cannot sanitize a metaphor.
No.
No amount of hand washing, no amount of boiling the water can remove a symbolic association from the mind.
That's exactly it.
I really want you, the listener, to try and inhabit that headspace for a moment, to truly grasp the exhaustion of this lived reality. Imagine sitting down to dinner completely ravenous. But before you can take a single bite, before you can allow yourself to swallow, you have to engage in a complex, agonizing moral negotiation.
It's just relentless.
You have to consciously fight off intrusive, vivid feelings of humiliation, degradation, and loss of control just to consume enough calories to wake up the next morning.
The cognitive load required to sustain that level of hypervigilance is unfathomable. It inevitably leads to what psychologists call dissociation.
Checking out, basically.
Yes. To survive the crossfire of this internal civil war, the author's consciousness essentially retreated. They began to feel as though their body was a separate entity, a demanding animal that needed to be managed and negotiated with, rather than their actual self.
Wow.
They described the terrifying sensation of alienation, of watching their own existence from behind a pane of thick glass. They were piloting the body, but they no longer inhabited it.
It is so deeply tragic because neither side of the Civil War was the enemy. Both the mind and the body were desperately trying to save the author's life.
Right.
The body is sounding the alarm saying, we need glucose, we need sustenance, or we're going to die. And the mind is sounding an equally frantic alarm saying, if we participate in this act of reception, our soul, our autonomy, our very selfhood will be destroyed.
They both have the absolute best intentions for the organism, but their definitions of danger are completely incompatible.
And this tragic stalemate culminates in a chapter of the manuscript titled, The Day Everything Tasted Like Ash. The author describes a pivotal moment where the sensory mechanics of taste were fully functional. They could perceive the salt, the sweetness, the crunch of the food.
But the psychological experience of nourishment was entirely vacant.
The quote that anchors that chapter is devastating. They write, "Nutrition remained, meaning had burned."
That's powerful.
The food offered nothing but the sheer mechanical obligation of survival.
Which is a powerful illustration of a profound human truth. We do not merely eat calories, we eat meanings.
Yes.
We ingest the social connection of a shared meal. We consume the comfort of a grandmother's recipe. We take in the cultural heritage of a specific cuisine.
So it's never just fuel.
Exactly. When those rich, layered meanings are stripped away, or worse, replaced by intrusive associations of trauma and disgust, the purely mechanical act of digesting macronutrients is incredibly hollow. The body gets fuel, but the human being starves. It quite literally feels like chewing on ash.
So what does this all mean for the rest of us? We've tracked this intensely painful, highly specific internal collapse. But if the manuscript stopped there, it would just be a tragic, isolated psychological glitch, right? A cautionary tale about internet use.
Sure.
But the author doesn't stop there. They take this deeply private agony and they zoom way, way out.
Yes, and this is where the manuscript transitions from a psychological phenomenology into a sweeping philosophical critique.
Okay, here we go.
The author begins to suspect that their internal civil war wasn't an anomaly. They start to view their atypical eating disorder as a radical private protest against a modern civilization that is built top to bottom on the logic of endless consumption.
This is where the text gets incredibly provocative. The author starts drawing direct structural parallels between the mechanics of extreme pornography and the mechanics of late-stage capitalism. And on the surface, those two things seem worlds apart, right?
They seem totally unrelated.
But the underlying engine is identical.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author argues that both systems operate on the exact same logic.
Which is what?
The commodification of desire and the optimization of human attention. Both systems assign value to human bodies and human experiences based purely on their performance, their visibility, and their ability to generate engagement.
And crucially, both systems rely on the constant aggressive escalation of intensity to hold that attention.
Right, because if your entire economic model relies on capturing human attention in an endlessly crowded marketplace, what shocked or engaged the audience yesterday becomes the baseline today.
The algorithm demands escalation.
You have to be more extreme, more shocking, more intense, just to break through the dopamine tolerance the system itself created.
And the author looks at this dynamic and realizes this isn't just about the adult entertainment industry. This is the water we are all swimming in.
Yeah.
In modern life, we consume everything.
We truly do. The manuscript argues that our fundamental mode of interacting with reality has shifted from experiencing to consuming.
Give me an example of that.
Well, we consume pristine landscapes through the lens of tourism, reducing complex ecosystems to backdrops for our own visibility.
Right.
We consume outrage and tragedy through the 24-hour news cycle, turning human suffering into digestible content. We consume entire identities through our political affiliations and the aesthetic curation of our lives.
It's all just content.
The text asserts that consumption is no longer just an activity we engage in. It has become our primary identity. We are defined almost entirely by what enters us.
I want to challenge you, listening right now, to look at your own daily habits through the author's lens for just a moment. Open your social media feeds. Are we just turning our own lives into content to be consumed by the void? Think about your last vacation.
Were you actually there?
Exactly. Were you actually experiencing the landscape, participating in the reality of that place? Or were you actively consuming it, framing it, filtering it to produce a digital product that someone else will consume in 3 seconds while they scroll on their phone?
That realization produced a profound existential dread in the author. Food, the literal physical requirement of eating, became the convergence point for this massive philosophical anxiety.
Because you can't stop eating.
Right. Eating was a daily biological reminder that survival inherently requires taking something from the external world. You cannot exist without consuming.
But the author's associative networks were so battered, so thoroughly scrambled by the logic of the marketplace, that they could no longer distinguish between healthy, necessary nourishment and exploitative consumption. Every bite felt like a participation in the commodification of the world.
There is a chilling question the author poses during this philosophical breakdown. If every part of the body can become a product, what remains of the person?
That is a devastating critique of how the modern marketplace has evolved. The manuscript argues that the economy no longer just sells objects or services, it sells meaning itself. A meal at a restaurant is no longer just a meal, it's a curated branding opportunity. A walk in the woods is an opportunity for wellness content. Even silence, the mere absence of noise, is viewed as an inefficiency, a void that must be filled with a podcast, a video, or an audiobook. Everything in human experience is optimized for efficiency, endless availability, and frictionless consumption.
I have to admit, sitting with that worldview feels incredibly bleak. It feels suffocating.
It does. If absolutely everything is consumption, if every interaction is fundamentally just exploitation and commodification, how do you even survive in that reality? How do you sit down and eat a sandwich without feeling like you're actively participating in the collapse of the human soul?
It is an incredibly dark place to inhabit. And the author is very transparent in acknowledging that their refusal to eat was, on a subconscious level, a refusal to participate in a system they found morally bankrupt.
Starvation was a form of abstinence from the economy of consumption.
Exactly. But the brilliance of the manuscript is that it doesn't end in that despair. It doesn't wallow in the bleakness. The final section documents a radical, paradigm-shifting alternative to this all-consuming worldview.
Yes, the journey from consumption to communion. And I deeply appreciate how the text frames the beginning of this recovery, because it states right up front that recovery could not be a return to the past.
That is a crucial psychological insight. In clinical settings, we frequently see trauma survivors desperately wanting to go back to who they were before the event or the disorder.
Which is impossible.
The author recognizes the fundamental truth of neurobiology. The person who existed before those associative pathways were built no longer exists. Innocence, once lost, cannot be unknown. You cannot magically erase the neural pathways the brain has constructed. The physical architecture of the brain has changed.
So if you can't go backward, and you obviously can't just grit your teeth and force the food down because sheer willpower just triggers the amygdala and restarts the civil war, what is the path forward?
You have to build a new path.
Right. The author writes that recovery began by asking a completely different question. Instead of asking, how do I force myself to eat? They asked, what does eating mean? It was a deliberate, agonizing process of assigning new meaning to the biological act.
And this is where the concept of neuroplasticity becomes a tool of salvation.
Right, because the brain can change again.
Exactly. Just as the nervous system is capable of learning destructive, contaminated associations through repeated exposure, it can also be patiently educated to learn healthy, life-affirming ones. The brain is not a static object. It is dynamic.
Okay.
Through a process similar to long-term potentiation, you can build new, stronger neural circuits that eventually override the old ones. The author realized that the opposite of consumption isn't abstinence. The opposite of a contaminated system isn't starvation.
It is communion. It is participation.
Precisely. The author began to fundamentally reframe the act of eating. Instead of viewing it through the lens of taking, exploiting, or being dominated, they began to view it as an act of profound dependence and gratitude.
They write so beautifully about the deliberate mindfulness of this process, sitting with a piece of food and actively acknowledging the soil that grew the wheat, acknowledging the rain, the labor of the hands that harvested it, the time it took to bake the bread.
Yes.
Eating stopped being an act of blind consumption and became a way of participating in the natural ecosystem. Instead of exploiting the world, they were in a relationship with it.
It is a massive philosophical shift that pays biological dividends. The physical mechanics of swallowing the bread didn't change at all, but the symbolic network surrounding the act was painstakingly, intentionally rebuilt.
They rewired the soundboard.
They absolutely did. By focusing intensely on gratitude and communion, the author was able to communicate safety to their nervous system. They lowered the threat response of the amygdala. They literally retaught their brain that this specific form of taking things in was not just safe, but beautiful.
I was marveling at the philosophical breakthroughs in the conclusion of this manuscript. There are lines that serve as a true antidote to the despair of the earlier chapters. The author says, the opposite of contamination is not perfection, it is acceptance. The opposite of objectification is not denial, it is relationship.
That reframes the entire goal of healing for any trauma. It abandons the pursuit of achieving a perfectly pure, uncontaminated state of mind. Because in a complex modern world, absolute purity is an illusion.
It's impossible.
Healing becomes about accepting the messy, tangled complexity of existence and choosing to build relationships with our food, with our communities, with our own bodies that are grounded in mutual respect rather than extraction and consumption.
I find that incredibly empowering for anyone listening, regardless of what struggles you bring to this deep dive. If meanings are constructed by our minds, even the most deeply painful, intrusive, stubborn ones, it logically follows that they can be reconstructed.
Yes, absolutely.
We are not permanently trapped by the associations our brains happen to make in the past. We have agency over our symbolic architecture.
The imagery in the final pages is incredibly moving and hard-won. The author describes the profoundly simple act of sitting at a wooden table, breaking bread, and discovering that the mouth can, once again, function as a gateway to life, rather than a gateway to contamination.
The goal was never to erase the past, or to pretend they hadn't seen the things they saw online, or felt the things they felt. The goal was simply to cease allowing that past conditioning to dictate the meaning of every future act. It was an active reclamation of the symbol.
And in doing so, the author achieved a reconciliation. They didn't just reconcile with food or with their past digital habits. They reconciled with their own humanity. They learned how to inhabit their physical body again, not viewing it as an object to be managed or consumed, but as a home to be lived in.
Okay, let's take a breath and unpack the immense distance we've just traveled together. We started by looking at the silent, insidious power of digital imagery to condition our most primal sense of biological disgust.
We mapped the collapse of a specific mind's symbolic world, exploring how the simple, necessary act of swallowing became hopelessly entangled with feelings of humiliation and danger.
Right. And we zoomed out to explore a sweeping critique of a hyper-consumerist society, a world where our bodies, our attention, and our landscapes are treated merely as products.
And finally, after navigating all of that darkness, we arrived back at a quiet table, finding a place of gratitude, communion, and profound reconciliation.
It truly is a testament to the immense double-edged power of the human imagination. Our associative minds have the capacity to build inescapable prisons out of symbols, but they also possess the power to build sanctuaries.
The manuscript leaves us with a vivid, visceral understanding of how deeply our internal mental landscapes are shaped by the media and the ideologies we allow to enter them.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, extending beyond the pages of this text. We've just spent this time exploring how one person's mind fundamentally rewired the meaning of a basic biological act, all based on the specific media they habitually consumed. As you go about your day to day, as you look at the screens you interact with, the algorithms you scroll through, the metaphors you casually use in conversation, ask yourself, what invisible symbols are quietly taking root in your own imagination right now? And what ordinary, everyday parts of your life are they slowly rewriting the meaning of?
That is a vital question worth carrying with you.
Thank you so much for joining us on this intense, illuminating deep dive. We'll see you next time.